Hi, this is Gary London, and I'm Senior Principal of London Moeder Advisors.
And I'm Nathan Moeder, Gary's partner.
And this is the first of what we hope to be many videos that address substantive issues that Nathan and I are talking about and what our clients are talking about with respect to land use and real estate. And this one that we're going to tackle today involves California legislation, which is called Senate Bill 10 or SB10. And Nathan, why don't you just tell them in a nutshell what this legislation is all about?
Well, essentially, the state of California has passed this legislation that allows cities to opt into a program where they can allow for up to 10 residential units to be built on a single family parcel. That's in essence what this bill allows for.
And it's basically an infill development bill. In other words, the idea is you can reach into urban areas of cities that are what they call in-transit rich areas or urban infill sites. And notwithstanding what the zoning is, whether it's single family zoning or something else, you can build these 10 units with certain opportunities, certain limitations. What are the limitations of the legislation?
There's no limitations for the state to opt into it at all. I mean, it's just a zoning that a city can decide to do if they wanted to allow 10 units, up to 10 units on an SFR parcel. But there was no limitations, no mention of affordable housing or unit sizes or anything like that.
There's not even any height limitations specified. That's all, up to the local government. So it's sort of carte blanche. You can come into neighborhoods, single family neighborhoods, and build up to the 10 units on the parcels. So obviously, this is an issue that has created a lot of both opportunity and anxiety. Obviously, developers look at it as an opportunity to do more housing, which is obviously much needed in California, and people who are against it see this legislation as an invitation to change their neighborhoods, in their opinion, probably for the worse. So what we thought we'd do is sort of do a deeper dive into the legislation from our perspective. And I've sort of just subdivided this video into 4 chapters. One is a description of the 2 sides of the issue. Then we'll address what might be good about it. And most importantly, why it won't work. And lastly, what would work that might substitute for this legislation, what we might want to look at going forward. So with that as an overview, let's just describe the 2 sides of the issue. Obviously, the first side, Nathan, is the idea that developers, and we've had lots of clients that have already taken advantage in places like San Diego and LA and other urban areas, can come in and they can, in essence, upzone neighborhoods as a way of addressing housing shortages, and in recognition of the fact that building outside of the urban areas has become increasingly complex, if not impossible. So that that's sort of the upside of all this, the opportunity to build more housing. The more housing you build, the more people get housed. Presumably that has some impact on pricing or lease rates, and there's a lot of enthusiasm around the state for infill housing right now. It's really the new darling of real estate development on the part of not just developers but policymakers. But there's a downside. There's another side to this issue, and I'm going to let Nathan sort of describe the downside.
Well, I think the downside that we're hearing from people is it tarnishes neighborhoods. It changes the character of the neighborhoods. You may have a 3-story project looking in on your backyard. It's a violation of privacy. It's all those kind of arguments. Going back to the positive side real quickly, though, there's a lot of small developers out there. There's lots of architecture schools around town and in the state, and it's trying to have these smaller architects do a critical need out there in the region. and find some small infill property where they could build, 5 or 10 units and create some housing. So it's kind of a gift or a benefit to that micro industry, a small industry, to mom and pop that may want to develop something. But it does have repercussions and getting pushed back in terms of neighborhood character and other impacts that are not frankly being considered, and the city and the state doesn't care to consider it. But parking issues, right? Off-street parking, it doesn't have to be provided on site. These are real issues that residents are legitimately bringing up, and they should be concerned about and are concerned about. But there's no guidelines of how to address that. So that's kind of a big question mark that's out there right now.
Right. And so what happened, as an example, last week in the city of San Diego is the City Planning Commission basically embraced the idea of more housing in urban areas, but cut out the idea of including the SB10 legislation. And the mayor and city council now have the opportunity to sort of address the issue whether they want to continue to include the SB10 provisions or exclude that and work on some other way of providing density in the city. And that's currently really the hottest issues. So I have a column that I participate in the San Diego Union Tribune called The Econometer. And they asked all the people that participate in this column, economists and business people, both, what they thought about SB10. And I answered, in essence, that I'm in favor of it. But my concern was that even though the goals were laudable, let's provide housing, let's create infill, the SB10 legislation had flaws. And frankly, that's been the corpus of the discussion that you and I have been having, Nathan, the flaws in the SB10 legislation. So why don't you just go to the heart of that and address that?
All right. When we reviewed the initial legislation of SB10 that allows up to 10 units on a piece of property, we did some analysis. We talked to people. We know the development costs and what it takes to build projects. In our view, the city legislation that was put forth here for the city, that policy and that action was dead on arrival. That it would not result in any housing units. And here's why. It was flawed because basically it took the state legislation, which was you can build up to 10 units, and it added a whole bunch of other caveats to it. Basically what happened is this policy in the city of San Diego is there's too many cooks in the kitchen wanting too many different things, from affordable housing to let's have family housing be represented as well, and let's also equalize housing access for every single person. Economically, it won't all work under SB10. We have to focus on just a certain amount of policies. There's no one blanket policy where you can address all three of those major issues, which are important issues in our region, and have this one policy blanket all issues and make them better for the communities. So that was kind of the big issue why this policy wouldn't work.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So when you say economically, what you're honing down to is financial feasibility, aren't you?
Financial feasibility. So let's break it down. The first one is the city added on to the SB10 legislation. So it's 2.0 or 3.0 or call it whatever you want. But they took the state legislation and they said, well, let's make it that you have to do an affordable housing unit if you build 10 units. And then also, so basically what the city did is they took SB10 and they added on their own additional rules for this policy. The first one being that if you build 5 units on the property, you have to build 1 affordable unit. And if you're in a high resource area, which by the way, anything high resource is an expensive housing market. So basically consider anything north of Interstate 8. Then you have to add an additional affordable housing unit. So 1 divided by 5 is 20%. 2 divided by 5, that's going to be 40%. In our studies that we've done, many feasibility studies for different developers, from small projects to big projects, there's pretty much a break-even point in affordability. It's 10 to 15%. If you include that amount of affordable housing, that's your break-even point. Anything above 10 to 15%, any project can run into some feasibility issues, meaning that they can't service the debt, they can't achieve their prospective returns, or they can't afford to buy the land because the land's too expensive. So my first intake on this policy is that the affordable housing requirement of 1 for every 5 units, 20% or 40%, the numbers will not pencil. It will not work. So that's the first threshold.
In other words,
right there.
Because it can't meet that threshold, projects won't be built. So all this concern about the city of San Diego's SB10 commitment is probably inconsequential, because developers aren't going to step up because the deals aren't going to pencil.
Right. So that's for one factor. The other factor now is there was an additional rule added to SB10 for the city of San Diego, and that was to add a family housing unit. There's a certain percentage of 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms that you have to do on the property as well to create family housing. And I will fully admit that I was part of this crafting of the legislation to help encourage the affordable housing. So I was working with the city of San Diego to give different ideas, run some scenarios to create family housing, because that's my belief where we're very short in this region, is the ability for families to have housing options. So the problem with this, when you add it into the equation, is that larger units achieve lower rents. It might not make sense because technically they do pay more money, but everything comes down to a per square foot basis when you look at real estate. So if you have a studio that makes $4 a square foot in rent, a 2-bedroom unit, a 3-bedroom unit might only get $3 per square foot in rent. So on average, larger units, 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms, achieve about 30 to 50% less rent than the smaller units. So that's the other challenge of feasibility in this legislation as well, is if you are mandating 2 bedrooms and 3-bedroom units, you have to acknowledge that it's going to lower the achievable rents in the development. And it's going to result in a feasibility issue there. So compounded that with now the affordable housing requirement, these numbers will not pencil. And then there's a third element, but I'll pause here in case you have some thoughts.
Yeah, pause for a second because we want to get to the third element, but I just wanted to point out the fact that we're big backers of this idea that we need family housing. What we've seen in terms of infill housing development that's been encouraged in the city of San Diego and other cities over the last few years is a lot of apartments have been built, but typically they're your mix of higher density units, studios, 1s and 2s, very little, if any, 3s in most projects. And it's hard for us to believe that families are going to be able to be accommodated in most of the units that have been built. They would be able to be accommodated, and this is sort of a shift from, certainly in a place like San Diego that's kind of going from horizontal to vertical, going more urban. The idea would be that families need housing, and that's where the deficiencies have been, but that this is not the solution to family housing, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So our third challenge to feasibility is the price of land. That's not considered in this equation. So if you looked at it, just to give quick numbers, let's just take the median price in San Diego of a single family home. It's $850,000. If you can build 10 units on that property, that comes out to $85,000, just divide it by 10. $85,000 per new housing unit that you will build. So how do we consider that number? Well, I'll tell you that based on our studies that we've done throughout Central San Diego and the city of San Diego, is on average, new rental apartment units, new land goes for $40,000 to $60,000 per unit. If you're in the higher quality areas where the rents are expensive, you could probably get $60,000 to $80,000 per housing unit. So these smaller deals at $85,000 a housing unit, it's too expensive. Nobody will buy an 850,000 square foot home and tear it down. There's not enough value or profit in there for any developer. So the land value, for that to work, I mean, you probably have to put on 20 units on a single family home, but then you get into physicality, and is it physically possible to put that on there, or is it too expensive? And that's if we build 10 units on a property. The other aspect of SB10 that was adopted by the city was that you could do 1 unit for every 1,000 square feet of land. So, typically you have a 5,000, 6,000 square foot plot of land on a single family home. So realistically, most of the lots, you can only build 5 or 6 units on it. So if we're taking $85,000 or $850,000 home and you divide it by 5 units, that comes out to $170,000 per unit. No apartment developer or rental developer will be able to make that number work. Housing is just too expensive.
So despite all the stress on both sides on this issue, the bottom line is they're not going to meet the bottom line. These units aren't going to be built under this particular legislation.
Of course. Yeah. That's the way we see it, is that there's not going to be much done, if at all, if the legislation passed as is in the city of San Diego. Of course, you're going to have some people that take advantage of it, but by no means is it going to result in a large magnitude of housing. And the other thing that's being neglected in this whole equation that cannot be ignored is when you talk about small developers, they're not the big guys. The big guys have cheaper debt financing. They can get economies of scale, and there's cost savings. And because they do a large number of developments, they can get preferred pricing with contractors or find it cheap because they're buying on scale. With little developers, which is SB10, they face higher financing costs, higher investor returns that have to be met. And that's another whole feasibility challenge that we're not even discussing. That could be a whole different video. But that's the other thing, is when we create policy, we have to keep in mind of what's the business look like for the small guy versus a big guy, and how can we adjust that policy to accommodate both.
So let me just step back and talk more on a qualitative basis what some of the angst associated with density in general is, not just SB10. It's the newest issue, but it certainly isn't the only issue. The real issue is change. And the issue is that the concern on the part of people that oppose this kind of density, whether it's SB10 or anything else, and they do oppose it. It's not just SB10. There's a whole bunch of people out there, maybe most people, who oppose the idea of infill. Their concern is that it will destroy what they call traditional neighborhoods. Some people would accuse them of being NIMBYs, not in my backyard people. So, there's a concern for just change. And we've learned over the years that, land use issues are all about change. And, there's a number of ways to tackle that in terms of, how do you even reply to people that are concerned about change in their traditional neighborhood? One of the things that I always remind people of is that it all depends on what your definition of traditional is, doesn't it? In other words, traditional might be traditional for them, but all they have to do is, look at an old photo, say 100 years ago, of the neighborhoods that they lived in. And they'll find that it was a very different neighborhood. The homes were very different. They were much smaller, older. A lot of the infrastructure, the roads, the plumbing, electricity, all of that was not there. The neighborhoods did change. And over the years, we redefine what is traditional. So I think that's one question. And the concern that we have as economists, as market analysts, is that we have kind of a housing conundrum going on in urban areas. San Diego, LA, Santa Barbara, anywhere you look along the urban coast on the West Coast. And it is simply this. We've basically legislated or litigated ourselves out of allowing development in the what we'll call greenfield areas. In San Diego, that mostly means the unincorporated areas of our county. Essentially, the county of San Diego has elected not to participate in the development of housing, whether there be subdivisions or whether they be master plan communities. Well, traditionally, the way San Diego has grown and accommodated the growth is by building out. And there's no more out to build anymore in San Diego. So hence this sort of reversal of focus on infill housing in neighborhoods. But here's the problem. San Diego needs, according to their own assessments, by 2029, 108,000 new housing units. That means that, more than 15,000 housing units have to be built every year. The problem is that the city's been building way less than that, half that number of housing units in any even good year. And so because they haven't been able to build subdivisions, because we haven't been able to build master plan communities, the only solution has been infill. And you can count all the infill projects, all the apartment projects that have been built. By the way, most of them have been apartments, not even condos, for reasons that go beyond this video also. You can count all those up, and those small incremental projects don't make up enough units to make up for the fact that we have these deficiencies. And the deficiencies are perpetual. So ultimately, the reason these infill policies, as correct as they are in my mind, with the exception of sort of weird legislation like SB10, most infill policies we would want to support. Even when we support them, they really don't get to the heart of the housing crisis. And that's really the big issue here.
Well, I'm glad you bring up the Sandag forecast and we need 13 to 15,000 housing units a year. The problem is all those numbers is nobody's paying attention to those numbers. The state of California is not even paying attention to the numbers. State of California, if you read housing elements, they say that we need X number of units at these various income levels. And that's frankly the wrong way to be ascribing and planning for housing, because guess what? A unit is a unit. So if you build a small studio of 500 square feet, or you build a single family home, that's considered one unit. Nobody, the cities or the state of California, is looking at what type of housing are we actually building. We track permits, but we don't track, are those 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms? Does it accommodate families? We've investigated this. We've looked into this the last couple of years. And what we've noticed is if you look back in the 2000s and all the housing that was built in San Diego County, 1 out of every 10 units being built was what we call a small unit. So a studio, a 1 bedroom. Okay. If you fast forward to basically the past 5 years, the latter 2015 to 2020, we were building 1 out of every 3 units. 30% of our housing inventory has been small units of 1s and studios. And now this new dynamic of a micro unit, which is smaller than 500 square feet. And the problem is we need to see, is that the right type of housing we should be building, especially when we've cut our single family home production that accommodates families by 6,000 to 7,000 units a year. We haven't talked about how to replace that yet. All we're focusing on is, or what policy is allowing to happen, is for these smaller units to be encouraged to build. But it doesn't do much. It doesn't do anything. The Union Tribune highlighted some engineer that I recall that makes $100,000 a year, and he's divorced and has 2 kids, and he needs affordable housing. And if we looked at the actual housing that we're building, if we build a micro unit, if we build a studio, that doesn't help somebody of this demographic. And we need to start thinking about how can we start building this family housing, because while there's a demand, and it will be argued that, well, there's demand for those smaller units. Yes, that's true. But there's also a significant pent-up demand for housing for families. And that's the type of housing that really, I will say, drives the economy. When you look at jobs and you look at how industries work in different employment sectors, those are driven by employees that are in the middle of their career. People in their 30s and 40s, they run the company. That's the talent that's needed to make companies operate. It's not the old senior people that are maybe half retired, and it's not the young people. So we're seeing this exodus of people that can no longer afford San Diego, let alone California. And it's resulting in this bid up of wages, and people can't afford to live here because they don't, frankly, have the housing to do it. And then let me just say one more funny thing. And then, Gary, I know you're probably buying at the bit to jump in on this. We always have kind of our sometimes fun taglines that we make in speeches. And one of the taglines I say, San Diego has turned into a great place to live when you're in your 20s. But once you hit 30, you're going to jump ship and you're going to go to Raleigh, Durham, or you're going to Austin, Texas. And I used that line in a speech up in San Francisco, and some woman just belted out laughing when I said it. And I just carried on with my speech. But afterwards, I sat down, and she was actually next to me, and she looked at me and she says, "I have to apologize." She's, "Oh, you said that, when you turn 30, that you move out of the state." And she says, "I have to tell you, I turned 30 last week, and I'm moving to Raleigh next week." And case in point, it's happening. It's a funny thing, but it's a sad thing, but it's important. This is no longer a housing issue. This is an economic issue, and we're not going to see it. It's not going to slap us in the face, but it's already here.
You took away my punchline, which is that, don't we really have to reframe this as an economic sustenance issue for metropolitan areas? Because at some point, cities don't prosper and much less survive or grow unless we provide the necessary ingredients for them to grow. And the most necessary ingredient is housing. I mean, you can just look at a history of America, and you can sort of compare the growth and development of San Diego with Detroit. Does a metropolitan area want to be Detroit, or do they want to be San Diego? It's not about the weather. That's a little bit about the weather, but it's mostly about the fact that we've been able to grow and sustain that growth economically. So ultimately, what I always say to people, and this will be another video, but ultimately, this is not an issue that ought to be framed exclusively as a housing issue. This is an issue that has to do with economic sustenance, and therefore, we need to get businesses involved, and the various Chamber of Commerce is involved, and we need to create carrots and sticks, mostly incentives, so that businesses and perhaps unions, everybody can get involved in taking care of their own, or at least pushing for legislation that creates opportunities for not just jobs, but for housing and jobs mix. So I guess the point is that we've been hyper focused on building inside of cities, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. And you go into many communities and you see the new projects that have been built. Many of these projects are really quite wonderful, and they add a whole new element of energy and excitement and affordability to the communities that we're in. And I can cite all kinds of projects that you and I have been involved in doing the economic studies for. But at the end of the day, that is simply not enough. The issue has to be reframed as an economic sustenance issue. Policymakers need to get together. I gave a speech at our regional COG, SANDAG, San Diego Association of Government, a year ago, and I talked to many of the mayors and council people that sit on the board of this regional planning organization, and I essentially offered up a message of, you got to talk to each other. You got to cooperate. The county and the city of San Diego and all the small cities really need to have a sort of a come to Jesus conversation. They need to recognize that they have to have a wake-up call with the idea that we just can't eliminate the kind of growth that has served us well over most of the last half of the 20th century. The formulas that we're working now just aren't going to work. So I think, if you will, the bottom line here is that essentially we're having the wrong discussion. We're basically, when we talk about infill, we're basically biting around the edges, but we're not really getting to the heart of the housing issue, which is that we need A, a lot more housing, B, we need a lot more family housing, and C, we need housing. We need to start connecting housing and employment and jobs and transportation in a much more effective and beneficial way than we are today.
So let's circle back to SB10 one more time. And I think it's important not only for SB10, but for all housing policy. It seems that anytime a new potential law comes up, that it has to include everybody and include affordable housing. And it's designed to be a catch-all for every single thing. I think, it's not that I think, the economics show that not everything can be accommodated underneath every single policy. So, for example, with SB10, there's significant feasibility challenge that is going to result in not much being built. The way that SB10 should be utilized is because of high land values. That should be utilized as a program that encourages townhome development for families, because for sale townhomes can't afford that higher price per unit. If you're talking $120,000 to $175,000 per unit, depending where you are in the city, you can afford that. Now, it might not work if you do affordable housing, because you have a townhome unit that might sell for $800,000 or $900,000, but the affordable unit you can only sell for maybe $250,000 or $300,000 unit. It's too big of a hit. But the message, I guess, is that's okay, because there's plenty of people that will never qualify for affordable housing that are truly suffering in this region, but they don't qualify for that income restricted housing. And I think that's what's being ignored in all of this conversation, is that market rate is bad. It's a bad word. Nobody wants to worry about market rate. They're totally fine. We need to focus on the affordable. And we should focus on affordable, but we should focus on both. And we should recognize when some policies will not work for both. And in this case, I think this is a policy where it can deliver housing to those that are not affordable, but are market rate, that are just waiting in rental units or crammed into a 1-bedroom plus a den or a 2-bedroom, and a family that needs to move in and have home ownership opportunities. And I think that's okay. And that's how we need to approach every single policy. But I think the problem is, when we have a policy, everybody has their hands in the cookie jar and everybody wants a piece of it. It gets muddled, and then nothing's really going to work. So we really need to be and this is not just a criticism of any specific city, but the state of California as well. And I think that's probably why the state left it so blank with SB10. It said, here, you can build up to 10 units if you opt in. And that's all the city of San Diego had to do. They could have left it all market rate housing. And I think they should, because that would open the floodgates on townhome development. That's what we need right now for families that's not being catered for.
Yeah, I always mention when you talk about townhomes that I happen to own a row home in downtown San Diego. I've owned it for over 20 years. And essentially it's part of a 1/3 block project, 17 units. And it's an almost 2,000-foot unit, but it goes up 3 stories and it sits on essentially 700 feet of land. So you can create a lot of density, but it's a single family home, can be very adaptable to families in the neighborhoods, and feels much like a step up from the traditional 5 or 7 or 8,000 square foot lot to a much smaller lot. So you don't have the yard space that you might have had in the suburbs, but you do have the what we call the conditioned space, the interior space, and you build parks in the neighborhood, and you create a sort of a semi-urban setting that can be perfectly valid and accommodatable for families. So there's a lot of creativity we can put in this. And I guess really what you're saying, Nathan, is that the legislation at the state level, in this case, invited an opportunity, and the city itself and its policymakers need to be a lot more creative with that legislation, and they need to be less prescriptive in terms of the restrictions, and maybe it would work.
Yeah, I think they were too creative, which resulted in all the additional rules that they added to it. So I think it should have, a hands-off approach would be a little bit better, but let's acknowledge it. From the city's perspective, nobody wants that at the city wants to be the one that says, oh, we shouldn't do affordable housing, or no, we shouldn't do family housing, or no, we shouldn't do small units. I mean, it's not politically popular to raise your hand and say, we don't need to do this, but you know, we're economics. We're just saying it how it is. These are the numbers.
Well, let's do that one last topic before we end our discussion here. It's not politically popular, and the question is, why isn't it politically popular? Well, one is just the what you mentioned earlier, the sheer physicality of it. You know, putting density into neighborhoods that are sort of traditionally single-family neighborhoods is not particularly popular to people that live in those neighborhoods for both practical reasons, parking and other kinds of infrastructural issues, but also they regard it as sort of as an intrusion. One of the issues that has been brought up to me frequently, and that they peddle, the people that have been against this legislation, for that matter, any infill, is that as soon as you start adding density projects in single-family neighborhoods, it devalues the housing of the neighborhoods. But I've never seen that to be true. I mean, I think all you have to do is go to a place like the neighborhood of North Park, San Diego, which for many decades has been gradually allowed to build more apartment units. And if you happen to own a single-family home there, I don't think the house has gone down in value. I think it's probably gone up in value the same as any other house. And I think that's sort of a canard that people against this put out. And I don't see that as being the case, certainly in the situation that we have addressed ad nauseum in this video, which is as long as we aren't building enough housing, period, it is going to, bid up the price of housing everywhere.
Yeah, I think if you're because we have so little housing offered on the market for sale, I mean, you're going to have high prices no matter what, even if you're building a duplex, a fourplex, or a 10plex next to a specific property. Now, if it's totally staring into your backyard like a sore thumb, that could be one issue hypothetically that's increasing or decreasing land or property values, but
maybe relative to other homes in the neighborhood, but probably not overall. Anyway, that's one issue that's brought up a lot, beyond the aesthetic or sort of the intrusion issue. And what's curious to me is it's brought up by what we don't bring up is other things that have limited housing opportunities in neighborhoods. And I know this will be the subject of another discussion at some time in the future, but we have a pretty large segment of neighborhoods whose homes are designated historical, which means that you have to go through a big labyrinth of public policy approvals in order to remove or change the housing, which burdens the housing owners and tends to eliminate new housing in the neighborhood or discourage it. And on the other hand, it takes the housing that is designated historical off the tax rolls if they become subject to what we call the Mills Act in the state. And so they don't pay the levels of property taxes that sort of I do or you do in our non-historic homes. And these tend to these historical policies tend to both discourage new housing and bring about and also have a negative impact on the tax rolls. So I guess my only point is that we should be a lot more comprehensive in addressing housing issues and legislation and look at the whole thing. It is not good enough to say, I don't want new housing density in my neighborhood, because I would challenge you, if you're one of those people that this again can become a problem ultimately in terms of prosperity and in terms of our economy. And you probably are the same person that would be against new housing subdivision master plan communities in the unincorporated areas in the greenfield. So there's a lot of
people. Let me try something on that. And I agree, it could affect that person's job that's complaining about housing because they can move out of the region. My counterpoint to that is, if we're not building the right kind of housing, if we're just building these micro units and small studios and one bedrooms, what's the point? We haven't asked ourselves some soul searching in the region of, is that an adequate growth model for people to say, we'll just add small units, but when you hit 30, you got to leave? I mean, is that sustainable? Or should we create policy that says, hey, look, we have capacity for 100,000 housing units over the next 30 years, and we need to divide it up so that it's 60% family housing with multiple bedrooms and the rest can be small units. But right now we're not paying attention to that. We're just stuffing it with small units. And so I kind of agree with the NIMBY argument of waving the flag and saying how much housing development is enough. I think right now we're at that point that it's enough, because I don't see a sustainable model if we're not building family housing to keep the jobs here. I don't think it's fair to future generations to say, live here till you're 30, then you got to leave. So I think we need to take a step back, the whole entire state of California, and say, and require, just like we do with housing elements, to say, let's step back. What's your land capacity? How many units can you put there? And by the way, we need to proportionalize family housing versus small housing for every walks of life. I agree with Sandag's forecast, and we should have Ray Major on the show, or something. This is now a show, I guess. Okay. We should have Ray Major on sometime. But if you look at the Sandag forecast, and it comes from the state of California, is they're assuming that California's population is going to peak, and we probably are already peaking, and it's going to decline. And we're going to get older. And the problem is, I bet what's happening is we can't build the housing to accommodate everybody. So the people that have housing now are going to house hoard it, right? They're going to hold on to them. And then if you can't afford it, you're leaving. So I don't think it's fair in the forecast to say, well, we don't need the housing because the population's getting older and people are not having children, and so we don't need it. I think it's a chicken or an egg problem. I think we can't build the housing, and so it's resulting in this population dynamic growth over the next 50 years.
Well, and also the legislation, whether at the city council level or at the state level, our policymakers, our electeds, tend to focus on the short term, don't they? They're not looking at what the long-term implications are. And this are really, for the most part, other matters. If you have to get elected every 2 or 4 years, you want to stuff in legislation that addresses the here and now, which is fine. But the here and now is often, as I think what you're pointing out, is in conflict with what our future needs are. And you can have this discussion with respect to housing. You can have this discussion with respect to water, with respect to wildfire protection. I mean, name your poison, name your issue. And we don't look enough at the long term. And what we are seeing is that California is changing. Obviously we've had the first couple of years of slow or no growth in the state. That's unprecedented. That goes to affordability, and it goes to the fact that the state is no longer sort of the golden state that it once was, in that the jobs and the opportunities and the housing and all that were unlimited. And I think that's something that we have to legislatively, at least at the local and at the state level, we have to sort of look in the mirror. And we have to say, who are we really? What do we look like? And what are we going to be as we grow up? So I think with that, we'll stop this video discussion. I think we brought up about 10 different subjects that we can talk more about later. But thank you for listening, and we'll be back to you soon on some other topic. Bye.
Bye.